The front-end ecosystem is chaotic. It changes all the time. As front-end developers, we have to constantly be working toward upgrading to the latest and greatest new framework that we saw on social medias. We have to spend more time doing that than actually shipping features that help our customers. And it's just the reality. That's how the ecosystem work. Or is it? I want to spend some time and look at how much truth there is in that statement, in that kind of meme about front end development. Early in 2016, I got laid off from my job and I ended up having way too much time on my hand. So I wrote a blog post. The blog post was about what I thought at the time was the state of the art of JavaScript and the front end in 2016. The goal was to have a discussion and help my friends and my peers, the people that I had worked with, by putting together what my thoughts were at the time. Now, it was kind of a bad title, like claiming that I know what the state of the art is for something as complex and nuanced as front end development, but it's still useful as a tool. Now I can go back and look at it 5 years later and see what was I thinking at the time, what I felt was the best and greatest in the front end ecosystem, and look at it again with the lenses and perspective of 2021. How much did I have to revisit it? How many technologies that are like tools and frameworks that are no longer maintained did I get stuck with? How much did I have to upgrade? Or has it been reasonably stable and these things could still be in production today? Now, warning, this is extremely subjective. We're going to talk about a lot of technologies, a lot of tools, and I can't possibly be an expert in all of them. So, this is just going to be my opinion in 2021, looking at all these, again, all these topics that were in my original blog post to see how somebody would have fared over the last 5 years. Now we're going to start at the bottom because the juicier topics are at the top, and I'd like to keep those for last. All right, let's get right to it. So, as I said, starting from the bottom, the first topic we're going to look at is probably one of the hardest ones to talk about because it's not about technology, it's about people. How to use social media and who to follow to keep up to date with the front end ecosystem. Looking at the list in the blog post or looking at who I follow on Twitter, I'll be completely honest, it's kind of cringe. And that's not a judgment about those people or their achievement or their skills, but more about me and who I looked up to at the time. Pretty much all white dudes, pretty much all around React. There's no variety, there's no diversity. What I learned over the last couple of years is that the goal of these tools of social media is to solve the problem of you don't know what you don't know. It's pretty easy once you've identified a problem that you're trying to solve and know kind of the tools that could help you solve it to go and look up the documentation and training material and learn how to use them. But that does not help you if you don't even know you have a problem to solve or you have no idea where to start looking. So the best way to use social media, to use Twitter, to use Reddit, to use Hacker News, yeah, even Hacker News, is to have the widest possible blast radius. Essentially, you want to expose yourself to as much as possible, both in terms of technology, but also all facets of the field of software development. So, who should you follow? I wouldn't want to give you a name. Follow as many people as possible who talk about topics that you might feel are relevant to you. And then follow the people that they follow, or follow people who reply to them, but really you just want exposure. And following the folks who work on React or Vue.js or something, sure, it can be useful, but it's not going to tell you a whole lot that you won't be able to find just reading the documentation. And thus, my advice from 2016 just wasn't really useful. There's also another problem with social media. I call that TDD. No, not test driven development, Twitter driven development. Driven development is when somebody sees something on social media, a new piece of technology that's exciting, and immediately will drop everything they're doing to try and like get their team to adopt it. Often it means new technologies that are not mature, that are not necessarily well understood, or might not really solve any problem you have. Social medias are really good at getting us hyped about things that just don't really matter. So, the verdict: ignore any list of influencers and really just try to get as much exposure as possible with people from as diverse backgrounds as possible. All right, and now we can start looking at actual tool and technology. So, first, here, desktop applications. Use Electron. Next, of course, there's more nuance than that. We were just talking about social medias. You know something works and does what it's supposed to do when people are complaining about being exposed to it on Hacker News every other day or every other week. Electron has this reputation of being a memory hug, of sometimes being slow, but dang, does it actually get the job done? There's alternative that I mentioned back in the days, like NWGS, JS. They still exist and they're still maintained, but Electron has been pervasive. Maybe it's because it had a big name behind it, like GitHub, who originally developed it, released it, or maybe it's because there's big, very visible applications that use it, like Visual Studio Code, like Obsidian, my favorite note-taking app. But Electron is one of those tools that just does what it says on the tin. You can use web technologies to build a desktop application bypassing the typical browser limitations and sandbox. You can create an installer, you can keep it up to date. I only really see it being dethroned by something very different. For example, we now have progressive web apps, PWAs, which are basically websites that you can sort of install locally and have a lot of the same features that you normally expect from a desktop application. And you have other technologies like React Native for Windows and Mac OS, which let you build applications using React, but using the operating systems only. It's a UI very similar to how React Native can be used on mobile applications. And those technologies have a lot of potential, but they're very complementary to something like Electron. They're better for some apps, they're worse for other use cases. What is the verdict? Well, if you picked Electron to build your application in 2016, you have been joined by a lot of big names. It's pretty pervasive in our industry now. And if you want to build an application today in 2021, it's still a very good technology and very good tool. It kind of just works. You do have more options now, but they have just a different set of trade offs. All around, though, not a whole lot of shakeup in that field. Next, we have the API layer. Because if you have a fantastic web application using the best and greatest of front end technologies, you usually need it to talk to the server. In 2016, I felt like GraphQL was still rather new. No one was sure that it would stick. Sure, if you talk to somebody today, they'll probably tell you, oh, yeah, like I knew GraphQL was the future. But realistically, in 2016, there was a lot of churn in that space, a lot of tools, a lot of different approaches competing with each other. GraphQL was also kind of unique in that it was pushed a lot by the front-end community. Front-end developers really wanted it to happen, but you need back-end developers to adopt it, to be able to use it. So there's this kind of mismatch between who wants it and who has to do the work. Might not be an issue if you work in a smaller company or in a company that mostly use full-stack developers, then you can do both sides of things. But that's not everywhere. There were other tools too, like Netflix Falcor, which at the time I felt had a lot of promise. But all around, there wasn't any good surefire bet that we knew for a fact would stick. In 2021, though, the field has matured a lot. GraphQL is super popular. It has a ton of mind share and a lot of buzz around it. There's still a ton of REST APIs around. Those are not going anywhere. I think the main question around GraphQL is how to actually do it. You have a couple of big frameworks like Apollo and Relay that have a lot of mind share and a bunch of smaller, more lightweight clients, and some people roll their own too. Personally, I tend to lean toward Apollo. Again, very subjective opinion. But what I like about Apollo is that it's fairly simple and easier to pick up than some of the alternative. It feels a bit like some of the other approaches we used to build applications before it came around, like React Redux, which might have to do with some of Apollo's background. Relay is great, but it's a lot more opinionated, and I find it a lot harder to bring in an existing very large application to migrate to it. And also, I'll be completely honest, I'm not completely sure I fully trust Facebook with open source anymore. Like React and React Native that have a lot of traction, sure, those are great. But when you look at how they treated Flow and some of their other open source projects, I'm a little more conservative when it comes to adopting Facebook open source technologies. Again, standard REST APIs are not going away. They still work, and I think people will still be using them for the foreseeable future. So, from a 2021 lens, what's the verdict? No matter what you did, you were probably fine. If you stuck with plain old REST APIs, a lot of people are still doing that, and they're well understood and they still work. And people are still building those today. If you picked GraphQL, well, you're obviously in a very good shape since that has a lot of mind share now, and it works really well and it matured a lot. The libraries like Apollo did go through a bunch of churn. There's been some friction with breaking changes and upgrades, so you might have had some challenge over the last few years with that. But overall, it hasn't been too bad. And if you're picking them up today, they're a lot more stable and they don't change nearly as much anymore. All around, everything's pretty robust in that space, and you have a bunch of very good options. And this wraps up the first part of our retrospective on JavaScript in the front-end ecosystem in 2016, comparing it to the landscape in 2021. We've gone over people, we've gone over how to build desktop applications with the web ecosystem, and how to have your front-end app talk to your backend in GraphQL. But really, these are not the juicy topics, and we're going to get into them in the next couple of videos. In the next installment specifically, we're going to go deeper in the weeds with server-side rendering and styling, especially CSS and JS. And with that, thank you, and see you next time.